Ever wondered if immersion can stand up to a master's degree? Find out as Lamont and Cole, aka Hulk, explore this topic in this interview. Hulk, a native in American English, is armed with a master's degree in Spanish and a vocabulary of over 7,000 Cantonese words, all acquired through Anki and other immersion-based techniques. Lamont, an Australian English native who is fluent in Swedish, began with a speaking-based approach but is now on Team Immersion. Listen as they discuss their thoughts on immersion, how it stacks up to traditional classroom learning, and more.
When Ben and I discussed this, I was like, is his real name known to the community, or like, does he just go by Hulk? Because I'm totally happy to just call him Hulk, but
No, please.
But anyway,
yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'll let you sort of introduce yourself specifically around languages. What are your current target languages, or what languages do you speak? How long have you been learning them? All that sort of stuff.
Okay, yeah. So just to give a general overview, I guess, mainly I'm just a Spanish learner, Spanish speaker. That's the only language that I say that I speak, which I've been learning for roughly 15 years. And then the last 2 years, I've seriously been learning Cantonese. And along the way, dabbled in Korean, Japanese, Mandarin, Portuguese, and German lately, because my girlfriend is actually German. And I guess roughly speaking, so I had a very traditional or classroom-centric approach with Spanish, starting from 6th grade. I had Spanish classes all the way through college, and then I actually got a master's degree that I just finished in Spanish. All the Spanish classes, that's how many I've had. So I know I'm pretty familiar with the Spanish education system. I have lots of thoughts on that and like critiques. And then with Cantonese, which was like my only other language that I took very, very seriously, which I had more of a Refold-centric approach. So, and a typical immersion approach from the get-go, whereas the Spanish was so long, there's a mix in there. But
when you say you have a knowledge of the Spanish education system, do you mean the Spanish as a second language in the States, or do you mean the Spanish education system as in Latin America?
So I'm referring to the American Spanish language education system, and also the experience of a monolingual going through that system. I've had just a few classes in Spain at one point, but yeah, virtually all in the US.
Getting your master's in Spanish, I understand that was with mainly Spanish native speakers at a time that I'm guessing you would have considered yourself fluent in Spanish when you started that qualification.
Actually, that's well, first of all, I think in undergrad it was a mix. You had heritage speakers that were just trying to get an easy grade, and then the higher I got, it was like getting dominant by native speakers, especially because I live in the southern, where my college was in the southern US and San Diego area. In the master's, virtually everybody was a native speaker. But actually, when did I call myself fluent? It was actually so funny because I was essentially taking classes at the school before I was enrolled. I actually didn't really consider myself fluent until like right around when I was going to start the master's program, when I went really hard again and I got really comfortable. Because there was a period of getting rusty after I finished undergrad, and then I went really, really hard, and then I was like, okay, yeah, you actually are like fluent. I felt comfortable calling myself fluent. I felt the language just felt easy. So pretty late to call myself fluent.
Yeah, but I feel that's just a result of getting better. You consider that the level that you were at previously is suddenly not very, like, I'm sort of ashamed to say that I've considered myself fluent in Swedish for a very long time. But if I look back now, I'm like, oh, I was really only fluent like maybe a year ago. And there'll probably be in 4 years, I'll probably look back to now to 2022 and say, oh, I wasn't fluent then.
There were so many times like that I was just like, okay, now I'm actually good. And then a couple of years later, I'm like, okay, now I'm actually good. And then it just kept going. It kept going. And then now it's kind of settled out more or less because I'm not taking it seriously. But
it's a long time now, and so it's fair enough. And I feel that there's something to that whole getting rusty and then picking it back up again in a really intense way. I think there's a lot of energy in that can really result in a high level of mastery, because it means that, for me at least, it's like you could be good before, and then by allowing it to get rusty, you reinvigorate yourself for that. Because for me, it's all about what I can direct my energy towards. So if I can direct my energy towards one thing for long enough, then I can get good at that thing. But generally I can't. So it's like, let it get rusty, get bored of it, go and do something else for a bit, come back, but this time don't start from zero, because you've obviously had that experience before. So that's something I'm looking forward to in Swedish. As you went higher in your qualifications, you found it was more and more dominated by native speakers. Did you feel that you were at a bit of a disadvantage compared to them?
Depending on how hard the classes were, yes. And especially early on, and especially in undergrad, I could really feel the difference. I felt up until undergrad, I had lectures all in Spanish all the time, and I got comfortable. It was like subjectively, the feeling is like, yes, I'm like way behind these people, especially some of the people who are way above you. But practically speaking, in terms of like succeeding in classes and stuff like that, really a lot of it comes down to essay writing. You have all the time, all the dictionaries you need, all the time in the world to like proofread and such. Like your weaknesses don't really show, which is like if you had to explain and argue over points in class in front of everybody, yes, that's hard, and you would feel it for sure.
You mentioned that you've sort of dabbled and been dabbling in like, right this minute, would you consider Cantonese your target language, or do you still just, is it always sort of Spanish and these others kind of on the side?
Oh, Spanish is super maintenance right now. Yeah, I'm pretty much all in Cantonese right now.
When you were dabbling in other things, like let's say when you were at a less comfortable level of Spanish, what has been your primary motivation to go like, oh no, I'm going to go and get a master's in Spanish, as opposed to just, I'm now going to learn German to B2, or I'm going to learn French or something?
I think it's two things. One, you have to go to class, and then you just keep taking classes, and it keeps you consistently exposed to the language. So early on, I was very curious, but I wasn't that motivated, and it was more just a passing curiosity. And then I had classes, and then I kept going, and I kept going. I kind of cared about like being good. I wanted to know what it was like to be fluent, and I also cringed at the typical gringo mistakes that you hear with vowels and all kinds of things. I made an effort to pay attention, notice when classmates were making mistakes, hear the teacher not correct them, because you can only correct so much, and then work on it myself. Yep. Two, I would just fall off all the time back when I was like in my younger teenage days. Like I can't imagine if I was like consistent refolder back then, what it would be like now, because it was just constant dips in motivation, not caring. Like I would just, classes kind of go through the motion more or less because they're not super engaging. And it wasn't until like about starting college where I got more interested into like immersion and actually consuming content outside of the class and such. So
yeah, you were saying that you could be considered an example of it, one of the most successful classroom learners of Spanish, but also you just said then that when you got to college level, you started immersing and everything.
I mean, I did go through like the whole system that it exists, really. And I came out like pretty comfortable, but I think that misses a lot of context from like middle school, high school, where I was super unmotivated. I was super low intermediate. Like went to Spain around that time, couldn't really do much. Like a lot of my talking in Spain was in English with other internationals, and so like very limited. And then it was only really right in between high school and college where I started immersing and really developed some good ability. But like that foundation was pretty vital, and then input through classroom, through native classmates and the teacher and such was enough incidental to I guess carry me through, and along with my own curiosities and ambition to get me through.
But now in Cantonese, you're like coming at this from a refold approach, which if I was just given that information like with no other backing to it, I would say like, oh, that's kind of the wrong way around, because Cantonese is not something you can just like watch soap operas in for days on end and suddenly you'll like, whereas I feel like Spanish, French, German, Swedish, they're definitely like you could basically learn them from immersion only as an English native speaker.
For sure, the cognates to latch onto is a tremendous help, right?
So I just kind of talk us through that, the differences and how learning a completely non-English like language has been.
I think before, like, we're getting really close in Cantonese to where it's really not like this pretty approachable language. I think it's kind of been the Wild West out there. Every learner, they're like, what's going on with these two writing systems? Do they write this? Do they actually say this? It's a bit much, but that was part of the fun of it for me. It was pretty brutal at the start. So at the very start, like you're saying, pure immersion approach, can it work? I know it was pretty painful. So it was MIA back then. I was just starting. I was like, this is a totally new way to approach language learning from my experience. I agree with a lot of what's going on with the MIA approach as like Matt laid it out and Yoga laid it out back then. And I was like, okay, so maybe purely incomprehensible input to get used to the sounds is good. Early on, I started doing that. I listened to some podcasts that were purely in Cantonese. I listened to some, I don't even know what they were because I couldn't read. I knew they were in Cantonese, but I couldn't really read. I barely knew the topic. When I listened to this math lecture, I think, and it was so bizarre. It sounded like an alien language. I got used to some of the sounds. I did this I listened to maybe like an hour a day for like 2 weeks. And then I was like, this ain't it. I'm not about this. And so then I kind of kind of pulled it back from that extreme, like, I don't know. I don't really know that it's that beneficial, to be honest. I think you don't have enough to latch onto. If it's not similar enough, then you're kind of spinning your wheels to an extent. And so
Completely.
And so I was watching Dragon Ball, the original Dragon Ball, which is fantastic. I really like that, in Cantonese. And because you hear a lot that it's like, you're going to gradually pick up the low hanging fruit, even if it's very incomprehensible. All I would hear is, thank you, please, you're welcome. No, like these very common phrases. It's like, but like all the meats of like what's going on, the interactions, it's just flying by and very hard to grasp. It didn't feel like there was much. You have to climb the tree up a bit before you can get to the nicer fruit that's more fun and engaging to learn.
I would just say I agree with that, even just from the perspective of I did very similar things to you in Swedish. There was so much stuff that just went round and round and round that I was like, what are they saying there? It makes no sense because I haven't looked anything up.
And I know like people will say like, oh, you get used to the sounds. I think there's truth in that, but I would much prefer, what are these kinds of sounds? Listen to them in isolation, even shadow them at the beginning, like syllables, and try to get a feel for the tones. And then you go and listen to try to like hear them in the wild. If you're doing an hour of like watching anime at the start, no subtitles, I really don't think that's a good use of time. I think you need some words, you need some basic Anki vocab. I think you should read a little bit of grammar. And I think just doing a smattering, I think you can get these benefits of exposure to the sounds, 15, 20 minutes, try to play around, look at the language, and set off from there. You have a lot of people get really excited at the start. They want to do like 1-2 hours. And I think that leads to a lot of burnout. And I think we need to go to the more comprehensible stuff earlier on and for longer.
I'm told that you have a pretty good kind of elevator pitch for learning Cantonese.
I like this. So first, Cantonese, it's made out to be, by many YouTube videos, the hardest language in the world, super scary, 6 tones, Chinese characters, what's going on? And in some sense, yeah, it is kind of scary. And it was pretty scary at the start. And recently, and I'm talking very recently, we're pretty much on the cutting edge of like hitting this critical mass of, there's a ton of content out there. Now we're introducing subtitles, there's really good information. I'm volunteer for this dictionary, which is the best Cantonese dictionary, has monolingual definitions in Cantonese, English definitions, examples, the whole shebang. Amazing resource. And the idea that like there's not enough resources is kind of just a myth at this point. It's actually just not true. There's more than enough out there to really get you started. The only thing which is being worked on, I think, is like a good starter 1K deck. And then if we get some e-text of some graded readers, it's going to be a breeze, especially with some new tools being developed like Migaku. I kind of help support like their Cantonese development, so it's going to be amazing. And then with all our other resource projects here at Refold, it's great too. I think if you're interested in anime, they have a very extensive dubbing history of anime in Hong Kong. So a lot of the dubs are, I think, pretty good. Some even better than the Japanese dubs. I'm looking at Demon Slayer season 1. It's amazing. There's 2 dubs of that, but one of them is really good. So I think if you're interested in anime and dubs, we got a lot of rich dub culture, a lot of classic Hong Kong movies, and lots of dramas. And then there's even written content. You can read books, and you can discover a written language that's being developed as it's coming out. So the written Cantonese language is pretty young, hasn't been used much, only for the past like 100, 200 years or so. And it's kind of getting more and more developed and standardized in tandem with like that dictionary that I was talking about. And there's like a linguistic society. And so that's one of the coolest things to me, is like to see like a language, the written language kind of emerge and like be developed. And compared to Mandarin, I think we have like 6 tones is not as scary as it sounds either, because it actually makes a lot of the words more distinct from one another. And also there's more sounds in the language, so it actually makes you less reliant on the tones. So even though there may be more, it actually more than cancels out, and so you're less dependent on tones to understand speaking.
Okay, that's an interesting one. I noticed that except for that point, you didn't actually really fight back against it being the hardest language in the world. You just kind of went like, well, there's tons of resources. And I was like, there's still this kind of this looming shadow of like, it is a very difficult language.
With certain language like Cantonese, it's very, you got a steep hill to climb at the start. There's no doubt about that. You can't just jump in and read. You just have to know how to read these symbols. They're systematic, more or less. But once you have this groundwork, it's really easy to add new words. An example I like to give is like cryogenic chamber. In English, you have to learn a lot of these really specific words that don't show up much, like cryogenic. But then in like written Chinese, it would just be like cold temperature room. Or low temperature room, I believe, is a cryogenic chamber. It's in blocks. And so it's very easy to learn new vocabulary. I mean, the same characters will show up again and again and again and again. So the repetition, it gets really, really high with the same characters. And even though you can mix them around and form different words. So I think it's a very steep slope at the start, but then it's really kind of smooth sailing for the most part. So I think that kind of cancels out for Chinese languages.
And so going back to your Spanish, I guess, where you would be considered a successful learner by basically every measure, what about it is you personally, do you think has helped you to succeed, like even life experiences or just like your doggedness or whatever?
Yeah, well, I think accountability, I think, is the greatest value there. And especially when you're a kid, your motivation for such a long-term goal as like learning a language is very strained. And I think you see it with languages that, like Japanese, which all the resources that you can imagine, the most compelling content, people love the content and then they learn the language because of that. And at the end of the day, you still see people, they struggle because it's hard to just put in the work day after day, hour after hour. And eventually you're just like, yeah, it's fine. And you're not as excited as before. So I think the class system, accountability, and then the general curiosity of the language. When I was starting with Spanish, I thought like Spanish was like less descriptive than English, because like the words that I knew were so basic. I didn't know like the rich, expansive vocabulary of Spanish. So part of that was like discovering that. I was like, oh wow, yeah, obviously languages are pretty equally descriptive. I got interested in like the meta learning. It's not like, how do we learn a language? What is most effective is very interesting to me. And part of it was like, oh, what's most efficient? What is a good approach? And that's kind of how I discovered. I initially was watching people like Steve Kaufman, and then I finally clicked on a Matt versus Japan video. I didn't for the longest time because he had Japan in his name, and I was like, I don't care about Japanese, I care about Spanish. But
I had exactly the same thing, and maybe that makes me think maybe I should change my channel name, because people are like, I don't care about French or Swedish.
Actually,
but
yeah,
I was like, I don't care about this guy versing Japan.
All in my recommendations, but I put it off so long, and then I was like, oh wow. So he talks about general language learning. It was super interesting because it confirmed a lot of my experiences, and it challenged me on some points. So I was like, oh really? This is kind of a new idea. And I think I wanted to understand language learning, what it would be like to get to a high level. How high can you go? What is it like to like improve yourself at these higher echelons? I just thought it was very fascinating, the whole thing. And so that kind of perfectionism and just curiosity was like super important for me to get to where I am now, I guess. One of my biggest curiosities, and it feels like people pretty much understand and agree with that, okay, some level of comprehensible input, a lot of input over a long period of time, you will pick up words, you'll understand. Maybe SRS if you want to make things especially better at the beginning, maybe rare words at the end, or just do it throughout the process. But it still feels like output is kind of more of a mystery for the whole immersion community. A lot of people just they just put it off. Wait, what is the best way? What is like a very efficient way to go about outputting? I'm not too sure how I feel about shadowing in general. I feel better about like recording, listening, getting feedback from natives that way. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or it's just a general, I guess, curiosity.
My thoughts on that would start with the fact that I feel like my output is 50% of my actual competence in Swedish. So I'll say most things correctly, but even sometimes as I say them, I was like, oh, that was a super basic way of putting that. But I feel like that's partially because I early output in Swedish, so I got used to expressing my ideas in this very basic, the little Swedish that I knew. And then I've just kind of modified that and added some adverbs like very and really and a lot and stuff like. I think as in one of the things I would probably recommend to myself is to record and get feedback from native speakers. I'm a bit ashamed to admit that it's like, I should do that. Have I done much of that? Not really. I tend to just enjoy conversations with natives.
And I think if that's pretty common across the board, if you look at the best speakers, it's like, it's very painful to do like very intensive output drills and such. And you look at the best speakers, they just talk a lot of people all the time, and that's just part of their life. So
do you think the best actual speakers of a second language, do they just talk? Do they just have a lot of conversations, or do they do the painful stuff? Or both?
I think just almost nobody does the painful stuff. So I think it's almost like by default, yeah, people just have conversations because that's what you can do for hundreds of hours, is have conversations. Nobody's shadowing for hundreds of hours, at least very, very few people. So you just don't really see that.
But I'm kind of inspired from this conversation to go away and do something about it more than just get more input. But I think we should probably finish up. Thank you for sharing your multiple wisdoms with us
For sure.
about Cantonese and Spanish.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this interview, make sure to like the video, leave a comment, and follow us for more awesome content. As always, thank you to our generous patrons. Their support makes videos like this possible. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, the link is in the description of this video. See you next time.